Great. Thanks for being with us today.
Great. Thanks very, very much for the opportunity. This is very much a labor of love for me. This concept of citizen forestry has been around a lot of years. And I've been, my background is I've been doing this for over 40 years. I've got a couple of forestry degrees, and I've been an arborist for a lot of years. It's the best job in the world. I get the opportunity to work all over the world doing urban forestry, utility forestry, commercial. I still climb trees, A, because it's fun, and B is because you just learn something every time you touch trees. And I appreciate everyone here, especially those of us from off island, and Kevin over there in Victoria, beautiful spot over there, Forested College as well. Thanks very much for joining us. We're gonna go over this tree condition. Very happy to hear we're here to learn more, and we could spend days on this alone. So we're going to scratch the surface and start. And if you're like me, the more I learn, the dumber I get, because the more I understand, I don't know. So I'm going to try to get us more into knowing things to figure things out. But we're going to deal with it on a very basic terms here with condition. Tree condition, much like medical science, diagnosing tree condition is a really complex science. Again, I've been working on it for many years and still learning. So I'm going to try to share with you what we need to understand and be able to interpret and diagnose when we look at our trees from a inventory perspective. You know, we want to get an idea of what's out there, of course, and someone had mentioned trees. I think Dan had mentioned tree species is one of his challenges. It's mine too, Dan. There's so many species out here. Even I don't know half of them, it seems, but it's fun to learn, and they all have different characteristics. And as we look at them, we need to understand that we do our inventory, but we want to get a general idea of what kind of condition that they're in so that we can understand the condition, the character of our urban forest. We know what we need to do. We know what's out there. We need to know what we can do to manage it, and you know, the ones where we have challenges. So starting off, see, I got control here, talking about the conditions, and there's all sorts of metrics you can use with conditions. And we've talked about this quite a bit, and we've determined for our purposes and our goals here, we're going to stick with 3 conditions. And actually, many times professional arborists keep it the old KISS system. If you remember that, if you're aware of that, to keep it simple, stupid for us, sort of thing. So we like to do that. And I think with what we're looking at here, I think it's very effective. We're going to talk about 3 basic categories, elements of condition: good, fair, and poor, and talk about how we determine those. And there's a lot of ways to do it, but basically healthy. If we have defects and conditions that are not real serious, and understand, just like us, you're not going to find perfect trees out there. When we do nursery selection, and I counsel people on what to look for in nurseries, don't try to just find the perfect tree, because you're never going to find it. It's the same in the field, and trees are very resilient. So you can have a tree with some defects, some challenges, some conditions that relatively is healthy, and it's going to have a good life. So we want to identify those, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then fair. At what point are we having a few challenges, stress, health stresses? What are we looking for generally to get an understanding? And it's one of those, when I train arborists, a lot of times I tell them, you know it when you see it. Sometimes it's hard to break it down, but you pretty much have an idea that this is, it's not looking real good. And we talk about, with diagnosis, looking for patterns of abnormality. I know what this tree looks like, but it just doesn't look right. And so that's kind of what we are. And we've got to put some metrics on it if we can. And we've decided that a stress tree, somewhere between 10% and 50% roughly. And these are not definitive numbers, so don't worry about getting these right on the button. And then finally, poor. Dying tree certainly is in poor condition. If it's got defects, significant poor challenges going on, it's hard. I don't want to get too deep into it, but they're on a decline. They're on their way out. They're in poor condition, and certainly a dead tree we might call poor as well if we want to go that far. So those are our general categories: good, fair, and poor. How do you determine that? Much like a medical doctor, when you're doing tree diagnosis, you're looking at it. You're looking at the visuals. And probably the best thing to look at that's the most changeable and the most indicative is the canopies, the leaves, the foliage. When we talk about the benefits of trees, we get into a lot of discussions, and a lot of the measurements we use when we're talking about tree replacement and loss of trees is they talk about diameter. And of course, in the wood, which is the measurement of the trunk diameter, there is some value, but most of the value, the benefits of trees, come from the canopy. Most of the manifestations, the visuals, when we're looking at condition, we're diagnosing what we're seeing in the canopy. And we are looking at some other things, and I'll show you a few slides. But basically, we're looking at the color of the leaves, the size of the leaves, and the density of the leaves. And then one of my personal favorites, a quick one that I use, is dieback of branch tips. It's a way that I use very frequently, taking a quick look, because there's other things that can affect some of these other parameters, but they're pretty common. Now, the thing to understand about these we go through is leaf color. I mentioned earlier about patterns of abnormality. Trees have different shades of green. I've had a number of folks complain, kukui. Oh, my kukui, it's chlorotic, it's all light colored. That's what they look like. That's what they're supposed to look like, even sometimes variegated trees. People that aren't familiar with variegations, the white on the green on the leaves, they get a little excited about it. We can straighten that up. So looking at that, the leaf color and understanding what would be normal. The other challenge we face with coloration is what time of year it is. When you start getting into, when they get into their annual senescence and their leaves start to drop a little bit, start to turn color, you'll see leaves that aren't looking so good. You'll see things you might want to call poor, but if you recognize that cycle, and we're going to talk a little bit about that cycle in a bit, you'll understand that that coloration at this time of year is indeed generally normal. Leaf size, again, same sort of thing. Trees have an average leaf, but I will tell you, when trees are on the outside, the upper crowns of the leaves, they tend to be smaller because they can photosynthesize much better. When you start to see leaves on the same tree, interior of the crown, lower on the crown, they'll get darker and they'll get larger because they need that space to photosynthesize. So when we're looking at these, both with leaf color and leaf size, we're looking at the general canopy to get an idea of what's normal for that particular species. And we're not getting out with calipers measuring leaf sizes, so we're not nearly to that sort of a detail. And then finally, we get to leaf density. And again, this is one where species and time of year matter. Certain species just have sparse foliage. It's the way that they operate. And I'll give you one you probably know very well, and that's Albizia. Know and love to hate Albizia. In fact, the crown of that tree in its normal circumstances is not a very dense crown. That's the way they grow. They're pretty much inloaded in that the foliage is we try to determine what the density is relative to this particular species. Now we're putting all these things together as we're looking at these various characteristics and trying to get an idea of what the condition of the tree is from that. And then finally, looking at dieback. Basically, dieback is lack of water to the ends of the branches. Understand that the tree grew to this height, this length, the branches this length. They had adequate water to be able to send it out to the tips. And that water was interrupted. And it can be interrupted by a lot of different factors that we'll talk about in a bit. And I'll show you some examples. But the basic is that that tree has some stress and it's starting to die back. And that is really telling for me. And another thing I didn't put in, we can talk about all sorts of characteristics and diagnostic terms here, but I look for resprouting. You see real heavy resprouting along the branches. They almost look hairy when they're real heavy. We call that epicormic or water sprouts. That's also a sign when you get dieback on branches. If it dies back or someone prunes it too hard, it'll stop a hormone. It'll start releasing dormant buds, and you'll see that. But we're not going to get into a whole lot of that. I think these particular characteristics are going to be more than adequate for what I see around in our streets to help us get a pretty good diagnosis of what the general health, good, poor, or good, fair, or poor. So does anybody have any questions on this particular I did a good job. Now be kind, don't be honest, be kind. So moving right along, let's look at an example. Good foliage. And on the right, we have Kukui with light colored leaves. And on the left, we have actually a Listonia. This is a shot of a tree that I work on in Hong Kong. But even with the construction around the base and some of the disruption, this tree's still looking pretty good. Good full crown. I mean, if you know these species, you look closely, you just photos. The leaves are a normal color. They're a normal size, and the density is pretty good, consistent with what we would see of this species. So, and that's pretty much what you're looking at. And a lot of times I'll tell arborists if they're not sure they're getting a new species, Google it. Didn't used to be able to do that when I was a young arborist, but Google it, take a look, recognize you're going to see some different things. Go to botanical gardens, go out and try to find some trees, find a number of different examples to help you understand what the normal good would be, if you will. Fair. This is where we're getting into something. I remember our metric, our guideline was 10% dieback or poor form or poor coloration, right down to 50%. The one on the left is right about hitting that edge, that threshold. And we don't have to put too fine of a point on it, fair or poor. I would characterize the tree on the left as fair. I say that because there's a significant amount of dieback. The leaves on it are pretty normal green, normal coloration, the density's down. So I'm looking at a couple of characteristics and kind of putting it together. The one on the right, that's a poinciana, and the foliage is a bit chlorotic, generally speaking. It's got some dieback, and the density's down to about 50% of what I would expect at the time of year that I took that particular photo. So I'd say, it's fair. I'm not happy with that poinciana on the right. I'm not worried too much about it yet, but I'm worried a bit. The one on the left, I'm worried a bit more. That might be on its way down, but I'm not sure. And we're not going to try to characterize them too much. We're going to say that's a bit fair. And if you wanted to make some notes, I think that the tree is fair and seems to be declining. Whereas the poinciana on the right, I'd say it's fair and really not sure. Got to watch what's going on. I look at the lower foliage on the right. The lateral branches, I'm only seeing dieback on the top, not so much the lateral, so that's why I don't have as much worry about that particular one. But it's somewhat intuitive as we go through, as you look at these. And then we'll get into sad, poor, whatever you want to call it. These are trees, I think, obviously, they're on their way out. Tree on the left, I believe that's out of Alawana Beach Park. Clearly, that tree's about gone. There's a little bit of foliage left, certainly more than 50%. The one on the right, the monkey pot on the right, that's more than half dead. That's closer to our 50%. But I believe that's one on Sand Island. I just did an inventory on Sand Island for the state parks, and that's one I looked at and I condemned that tree. That tree is not going to recover, even a monkey pot, which are pretty tough trees. The ironwood on the right is one that I took at University of Guam campus. We've got some significant pathogens hitting the ironwood in Guam, and that was affected. That's right again about the 50%, but that's going down. Really big dieback you can see on that tree. And you can see it's denser inside. Those are those water sprouts I was telling you about. You see that combination together on a tree like that, and it's not going to make it. When is it going to come out? When's it going to go down? I'm not sure. That's another tree I would, especially with the building there, I'd recommend that they remove that. The dead wood's coming down. It's not really recoverable in these particular cases. So, so those are some examples. I mean, is everybody pretty good with that so far? Again, we don't have to have a real tight pointer, but Kevin has a question here. Just so he's clear, 10 to 50% damage in a stressed tree would be 10 to 50% of the whole crown affected by. Yes, you're looking and trying to put this together, and that's why I say, Kevin, that's a really good question. We don't want to put too fine of a point on it. Some of it is intuitively looking at it, putting those 4 parameters together, and saying, yeah, in general, this is somewhere it's more than 50% in trouble, less than 50% looking healthy, and so I would put that I would put that in a much lower class if I would. So yeah, so good. Thanks, Glenn. That's,
Kevin,
these are, yeah,
this is Dan. I'm
yeah.
curious. In this example, you said these trees are all gone, condemned, need to be removed. How do you get to the assessment of a poor tree might recover, or is it really a question of the specific situation, and then how much effort might be applied to, if you will, save the tree?
That's an excellent question. And so as we're looking at that, it's somewhat species related. There's some species that can bounce back. Some of it we need to diagnose what exactly the cause. And usually it's more roughly 90% of the causation of decline in trees is environmental. It's physiological. Only about 10%, and that's not a number to take to the bank, but very small amounts are insects or disease. Insects and disease tend to be secondary infectors. They're taking advantage of trees that are stressed. So a lot of times when I look at a tree, and let's say we want to try to recover it, we think we can get it back. Maybe in the case of the poinciana on the right, the one on the left I'm a little concerned about, but I'm seeing some hope there. So what I would look at that is I would look and do a diagnosis of the site conditions, and that's usually where we have problems. And I tell people, let's make the tree happy and healthy. And if I think by getting the tree what it's missing in terms of water, available water, nutrients, soil compaction is a big issue, restricted roots is a big issue. On mature trees, it is very difficult to almost impossible to recover restricted roots in terms of physical infrastructure restriction. If it's compacted soil, that's a whole nother issue, but we're looking at what caused it and can we bring that back? I've gotten a number of declining trees for many of my clients where I just get the turf grass away and put mulch on them. And I tell people, I shouldn't use the term, they'll explode in growth because they say it'll explode, they get all worried. But what I mean is it will turn them right around by just changing those conditions, and they will. Their natural systems will take care of the insects and disease problem. So I'm looking at species and I'm looking at causation to help me make that determination. And quite frankly, there's times I tell clients, I'm like, how much do you like this tree? It's going to take some time. And just like a doctor, I can't guarantee that we're going to be able to bring it back. I mean, I've got some trees in Saipan that blew over in a typhoon, monkey pods going up the mountain, and they all blew over, and they wanted to pull them up because they had some cultural, some historical significance. And I said, you know what? The root damage is such, and there's lots of foliage in them. Not sure they're going to make it. We can try, but no guarantees. But monkey pot, I said, if it was a poinciana, forget it. Avocado, I got a client with an avocado now that it blew over and it broke a lot of roots. He wants to pull it up. It's got foliage on it. It's not going to make it. It's a species that does not have a good defense system. It's not going to make it. So those are some of the factors. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that. So I got another question here from Melanie about, do you ever factor in the condition of the trunk in your condition value? Yes. Now, when we're looking at health condition, one of the things, I just came back from California training 35 arborists on tree risk assessment, and condition is a significant issue there. Structural condition. We do look at health from a potential perspective, but we're looking at decay. And one of the things to understand is there's several types of decay: heartwood rot, sapwood rot, root rot, basal rot, tip rot, pocket rot. All these different rots, when you get heartwood rot, a lot of them are not going to affect the health of the tree. They're not parasitic. They're saprophytic. They're feeding on dead wood. So when you're seeing, I do look at that, but if I'm looking at heartwood rot, it's a structural issue more than a health issue. And what I tell people is what happens with a lot of these trees, they don't die, they fall over. So we need to manage structural integrity, tree risk assessment, if you will. A lot of what I do is tree risk assessment. We look at health, and in fact, unfortunately, it brings tears to my eye. A really healthy tree. There's been a number of trees I've dealt with, heritage trees, exceptional trees, very healthy, totally hollow. Can't save them. I mean, they look good, but they're going to come over. They're going to fall over. We can't really help them in that case. So I do look at that inside. Now, if we have sapwood rot, if I see fungal fruiting bodies that are consistent with sapwood rot, a couple of the pathogens we have, Ganoderma, fomies, armillaria, Felinus. Those are T minus and counting. Once you see that infection, you can't, they're not curable. Our best technique is to keep them healthy and happy so they can resist, keep them from getting injured and that sort of thing. So if I see a conch on a trunk, people ask me, if you see a conch, a fruiting body, on a trunk of a tree, is that bad? Yes. How bad is it? Don't know. And that's where we have to identify what is the particular fungus that's, in fact, is a saprophyte or is it a, so yes, we do, but it really is more of a structural issue. So it was probably, again, more of an answer than you go on it. But and by the way, if I'm not answering your question, please don't let me get away with it. Let me know. I'm here to try to help you out, get your picture around that. So a large area rot, a lot of times if you're going to see rot, external rots in the sapwood, that's a bad thing. You're going to see it manifesting. You're going to see it in the top of the tree as well. Because typically when roots are cut and the side of a tree is damaged significantly, you're going to see dieback and leaf response associated with that, certainly in the short term. So, certainly let me know if I didn't get to that, but hopefully I did. Let's move along. And here's a question. Well, is it dieback or is it a deciduous tree just losing its leaves? That's an excellent question. And we have a couple of examples here. And looking at this, the one on the right, I think is rather clear. It's dieback. Now, looking at that tree, people say, well, a deciduous tree, the leaves are gone. Can I tell if there's dieback in it? And in fact, you can. I would venture to say, even you folks that may not have the experience that some of the arborists do looking at trees, when you look at the top of a tree and you see dead branches, on regular trees, look at the top of the tree on the left, and you see how those branches are nice and skinny, and they have a nice structure to them, a nice form. So with no leaves on it, you'd look at that and say, well, I mean, it looks kind of normal, just the leaves are gone. Might not be deciduous, but it could be. It's got fairly healthy foliage. And when we look at the tips of those, especially our tropical trees, we typically still see green on the tips of those. That's what I'm looking at. If it's low enough, you can see it. Whereas you look at the tree on the right, and the structure looks much more diminished. You'll see bark peeling off up there, and you'll see very stubby tips where the ends have, the dead ends have broken off. So even with a deciduous tree, you can tell quite frequently if there's dieback in that particular tree. But the way we're really going to tell if it's deciduous or not, typically is a species thing. Again, is why do they lose their leaves from a deciduous perspective? Well, and I get this question every fall, especially on the mainland. Photo period, the change in daylight. As the days get shorter, the trees pick that up in their genetic programming and they start turning. The other thing that happens is temperatures start to change. They start to get a little cooler and trees pick that up, and you'll start seeing that slow changing. Now here, temperatures aren't a big deal in tropical trees. Here in Hawaii and in the tropics, they're not such a deal. Photo period is a bit of a factor, but really it tends to be more moisture. Many of our trees are transplants from subtropical areas. They're not fully tropical. And we've got trees here, olives, for example. They are not tropical. I mean, I've done some consulting work, been fortunate enough in Italy on olive trees. That's cold there. They get winter there. So they'll grow here. They won't flower and fruit because it's too warm for them. Magnolia is another tree that's very temperate that grows here. And it's an evergreen tree, but we see that doesn't do so well in the lower areas where it's warm because they're not happy there. But at any rate, photo period will have a little bit, but it's typically their genetic programming. We have a lot of trees here that will drop their leaves under the normal temperate cycle, which would be the winter time, the fall time, the winter time. So you'll see a lot of those. And they tend to be species that live in subtropical areas and kind of bridge that gap. The tropical trees, the purely tropical trees, tend to be triggered on moisture primarily. So you'll see erythrina or willy trees. They'll go dormant in the summer when it's dry. And understand, there are tropical areas. I do a lot of work in Hong Kong and Guam and some of these areas, they actually are very wet in the summer. So trees that are native to Southeast Asia tend to be reversed. They'll follow that as well. So the short answer, I guess, is understand species. When do they typically lose their leaves? Are they winter or are they summer? And it's going to depend on the species origin and the ecology of that species. And that's what I'm getting down to. And we don't have a whole lot of those. And I think a list, Morgan, I think we have a list of those that identify those. Is that a fair statement?
We're working on it, but it will
Okay.
be in, it's something that we're planning on adding to the CF manual.
Great.
Yep.
All right. Great. Okay. Good. So that's probably the best thing. You know when you expect to see them turning and dropping leaves. Now, and here's some species right here. Common trees that lose their leaves. Nara, crepe myrtle. Monkey pod is native to South and Central America. And I see it down there. And in fact, it's fully deciduous in its native habitat. It doesn't tend to be as deciduous in Hawaii, but it will drop all its leaves. And people get all excited because sometimes they don't see that, depending on what's happening in our Hawaii environment. But understand that they are actually a deciduous tropical tree. Willy is deciduous. That tends to be deciduous in the summertime. Plumeria, gold tree. I mean, we don't pay much attention to it till it flowers and all its beautiful yellow flowers. Poinciana, and then ficus is partially. Wintertime, I get a lot of people calling me concerned about their ficus tree. It's dropping its leaves. The foliage is thin. Yes, that's what it does. They're not fully deciduous. They're partially deciduous. So understand that that's a normal behavior. So if we're out looking at ficus trees in the wintertime, you're going to see density. Maybe so the coloration won't be quite there because it's going through its natural cycle. So take that into effect as we're looking at our trees. And this is not a definitive list. This is a common list. I'm sure you recognize all these sort of trees. Here's some pictures of a tree that on the right, on the left, of course, plumeria. On the right, there's a deciduous tree. That's actually not one of our tropical trees, but when Morgan and I were trying to find photos, we were having trouble finding them. But if you look at that tree, you can see the form I was talking about earlier and how it really looks pretty good. The branches are well formed. They don't look broken off. It looks like a good tree, except it's got no leaves. So that's a deciduous tree. That's the time if you see something like that to ask yourself, is that a tree that's deciduous or it does have some particular problems? So what are some of the other reasons they lose their leaves? When would I see that? Physiological and biological factors is what we're looking at pretty much. When we get real dry weather, trees will go into defensive posture and they will drop their leaves. In fact, when we talk about risk assessment of trees and we talk about healthy trees, when you see a tree that's dropped its leaves, and Dan asked that very good question, well, when am I worried? If it's dropping it because of drought, then I'm not so worried. The tree's doing what it does. It's taking care of itself, preventing it from going down all the way. It's taking all that transpiration and closing it all up, dropping its leaves, pulling its horns in and kind of going to sleep. It's actually going into hibernation, dormancy, if you will, during an exceptional dry period. And that would be a case where I'd look at that to answer Dan's question. In that specific example, look at that and say, okay, we have a water issue. This is normally when it would be in foliage. So we need to add some supplemental water in this particular case, assuming that drought is the major issue there. And then biological factors. Insects, disease will get them to drop it. One of the factors that we have here with monkey pod is around June, July, you'll see the monkey pods lose their leaves. They actually aren't losing their leaves. The loopers eat them all off. And it's very short term, but their monkey pod will kind of in the winter, it'll go down, it'll drop a lot of leaves. Then it leaves out, looks happy. Then all of a sudden, wham, the leaves are gone. And people call me up on a tizzy. And you'll see them with big carpets around the base. That's people that know what's going on. They're trying to take care of those loopers. Basically a caterpillar that at night goes up and eats all the leaves off. So you can still see the rachis, which they'll eat the leaves, the leaflets off, and all you'll see is the stem in the middle. We call that the rachis, which is a part of the leaf. And so when I look up, if I see a monkey pod, June and July, if I see one with no leaves, I know what's going on. But you see all the little green rachis hanging on, and they'll come back from that. Now, that'll be fine. But biological factors will also, certain fungus, vascular wilts will also cause diseases and things like that. So trees that are normally evergreen are looking unusual. Again, a pattern of abnormality in terms of leaf drop. You want to ask yourself, why do you think that is? It's not, this isn't what it should be looking at. So maybe we need to look a little deeper, and I would suggest getting an arborist involved to further diagnose those things and get involved yourself. And it's fun to learn those sort of things, I think, as well. And then you'll know that. Another reason that trees will drop their leaves, and it's a physiological, I guess, call, is natural pruning. Monkey pods, very common tree, wonderful tree, monkey pods out here. But I tell people you got to prune those things every 2 years because they naturally drop branches in their inner crown, the lower crown. And this is actually a ficus here on the left that I did, and it's eucalyptus on the right because it's hard to get pictures in those dark crowns with dead branches. But every 2 years, they tend to self-prune. The branches, if they're not as efficient in the inner canopy, will start to die back. And you can see it here on this photo, and the ficus on the left, the lower, that big stub down there was dying back. It was very sheltered. It did a little resprout, and then someone stubbed it back. And if you looked a little closer, you'd see some other stubs where that's just natural pruning itself. That's what trees have done for millions of years, a natural prune. They compartmentalize off the dead branch, seal it off inside, just like the leaves, and it drops off eventually. We need to prune them because it falls on our heads and our cars and whatnot, so we need to prune them back. But other than that, there's really nothing wrong with that. You look at eucalyptus on the right, you can see those dead branches sticking out. If you look at the base, you'll see that white sock coming up. That's actually wound wood, where that tree is sealing it off, forming inside it, sealed it off, and when that branch drops, that will close it off. Natural process. So as we're looking at branches, if we see dead wood in the lower crown, especially inside, that is the natural process that's going through. So, so how do we record this as dieback as we're looking at a picture? So right here on the left, we have significant crown decline. I would call this flagging because we've got branches, individual branches dying back with some that are still looking pretty good. But we need to record those. Where the one on the right is more of a natural pruning sort of situation in the lower crown. I wouldn't even call that dieback. As I'm looking at my diagnosis, good, fair, or poor, I see some dead branches, not so worried about that one. The one you can see that the characteristic we're looking at is branches in the upper crown tends to be towards the end, which is why we call it dieback. It's dying from the tips back. It's coming down. So as we look at that, we want to be able to differentiate those two. Understand, here's another couple of reasons. Actually, here's a couple of examples. I'm sorry, I should have jumped into this. On the left, that tree is not looking very good. That's drought. It's over in Diamond Head area, and they're just not getting adequate water, and it's looking pretty good. And that dam, that's one we could bring back. If you look at that, you see that the density on that tree should not be nearly that much. The leaves are small, they look a big chlorotic, but you don't see a lot of dieback on that tree. That's
and Kevin, any good story deserves a punchline, and we brought those trees back thanks to the community and Smart Trees Pacific and a lot of yeah, and that's exciting actually.
Excellent. I love happy endings, and that's an easy one. Mulch is my favorite.
Mulch and the University of Hawaii donated mulch, and it was really great.
Yep, a good success story. So get that and check Dan's trees out there. The ones in the middle, that's actually Erythrina gulwas, which came through here. I guess it was 15 years ago. We had Erythrina, this is not far from my house, and just wiped them out. So the leaves are very deformed, they're very shortened. You see a little bit of dieback, but that would be an insect problem. And on the right, from our friend J.B. Friday on the Big Island, that's coal wilt. It's a verticillium wilt. It's a vascular wilt that goes inside, plugs the things up, and that's clearly dieback due to disease. So could be any one of a number of things, but again, the koa on the right is not recoverable. That tree is going to go down. The Erythrina, unfortunately, when they get that much of an infestation, they also aren't recoverable. They're not a very tough tree. Whereas if I got a monkey pod that gets totally defoliated by the looper, no problem. I'm right back. But if it got multiple defoliations in one season, we might have a little bit more of a problem. So at any rate, those are the sort of things. So there's some examples of what we would look at to see there. Flagging, I was talking about flagging for mechanical insects or disease. On the upper left, that's actually pear blight. That's a fungal infection where it kills a branch. You can have individual canker, they're fungus that will form a canker around a particular stem that will die. You can get leaf scorch, which I think on the right, which is basically just too much heat on a tree, which will cause that flagging. Again, to determine how serious it is, we need to know what it is for our purposes. We need to look at that. Flagging tends to be something that we can treat depending on the origin of that particular problem, but mostly flagging for mechanical. I'd make a note about that, what it is, but I'd make a note that it's flagging. And flagging means the leaves are still attached. It's still got that flag. So you can see it's happened. It was an acute infection. In other words, it happened just like that. It's not a long-term thing, a chronic thing where they're slowly dying back. So that's another example of something you might see, individual limbs dying back. And I'll tell you another place where that happens. When I see a tree and I see a branch, especially on one side, dying back, I look down at the base because the odds are something happened to the roots. Someone cut roots. That also will cause flagging. So look, you see one side of a tree dying or one big branch going, first thing you do is look down at the base of the tree and see what you see down there. So a real serious problem we have, and this unfortunately is not uncommon, and these are trees that we've taken, die back from mechanical damage. So Melanie was asking about trunk damage. This is when you'd see it. You see the one in the middle. They left the ties on. I hate tree ties. Many trees are tied and they don't need to be tied. If trees need to be supported, most of the time, in my experience, it's an inadequate root ball. It's poor nursery management. If you got a full crown tree with a small root ball, we do run that situation. Pine trees, palm trees are like that. You need to put ties on them. You need to manage them. You need to take them off before you run into this. I run into a lot of trees that have this problem, and people just keep tying them. And the problem is because they had a defect in the root ball they never fixed, and they say, well, it won't stand up. If a tree will not stand up after one growing season, you have a systemic root problem that you need to fix. That tree is doomed. And I've seen trees die 10 or 15 years later from girdling roots that were never detected. I had a tree in a park, and they were African mahoganies, and they're all about 35, 40 feet tall. And they all started slowly dying back in the park. And they asked me to take a look at it. And I looked, and they're all buried too deep. And they'd been there for 20 years. And I saw they're buried, and I saw a flat spot going in. I said, I need an air spade. I need to excavate these trees. I think we got a root problem. And so they we excavated them down. Those things had been buried 2 feet too deep. They had big girdling roots and fungus on the bottom. And we had to condemn 30 of them. 30 established trees down walkways had to go because they didn't do the job right in the beginning. So at any rate, that's just me on my rant. So pardon me, but that's the sort of thing you may see. If you see a tree trunk going into the ground with no flare, it's buried too deep. Is it too deep such that it's going to die and have a problem? Well, that depends on how deep it's buried. What we'll do is we'll start doing collar excavations, and we'll look at some other things, but I'm getting a little beyond here. If we see trees that are tied, that can be a serious problem. The whole top above it will die back. The other thing that's a bigger problem is on the right side, and that's weed eater damage. We call it weed eater canker. That has destroyed trees. I remember 25, 30 years ago, the city asked me to go look on King Street. The trees all along King Street were dying. And I'm in the vehicle with them, and I didn't even have to get out of the vehicle. I said, I'll tell you right now what they're doing. Weed eaters. You could look at the base from a vehicle going down the road and see the damage from, look just like that, destroyed from those weed eaters. And there's a trunk problem that you'll see that tree's doomed. They're just doomed. So we need to take care. That's a little beyond, but this is the sort of thing you might see some of the problems. And Dan, that's not recoverable. Either one of those is not recoverable, unfortunately. So that's that situation. Now, I should say, any questions about? I rambled on a little bit about that. Got a little beyond our condition diagnosis, but telling you some of the things to look at. So let's go down on our rating methodology, because this is where the rubber meets the road. As you're looking at your trees, you need to determine how I'm going to rate this. So typically what we will do is we'll look at a tree and we'll make a determination of what the dieback is as the whole of the crown, because that's going to give us the idea. You know, we're looking at that 10 to 50, less than 10%, less than 5% or whatnot. So I look at the tree, the middle of ficus right there, less than 5%. That's actually some ficus in Punchbowl Cemetery that the military Department of Defense called me in to look at, and it had a tip. There's a borer, and actually we discovered it there. It was a new borer. We have the leaf wasp, and that was the first time we discovered that. I found it in the stems. I'm like, well, this looks like a gall wasp in the stem. Maybe they're so bad they're not getting enough leaves. And we gave it to UH, and they said, no, this is a new pest. It's always wonderful when you find new pests. I'm being facetious. It's depressing when we find new things. But at any rate, that's what that was. So I would say that's generally less than, and that's treatable. We were able to treat that, catch it, put a little imidacloprid in there, and that took care of that particular problem. But we got to keep going over and over again. But that would be about 5. And again, don't worry about putting too sharp of a point. I would submit to you after 40 some years, I'm not very good at saying what the percentage is. Yeah, it's roughly less than 5. Tomorrow I might say it's 10. It really doesn't matter. It's not significant. That's why we've got some pretty good ranges there. Whereas the one on the right, I actually took that in Pohnpei, doing a project in Micronesia, in the capital, at the government buildings, and they wanted to know about that monkey pod. And I said, that's got some significant dieback. That's 20%, at least 20%. It's on its way out because it's tip dieback and really serious. We call that staghorn. But when you look at the dieback, it's only about 20%. Now, as an assessor in inventories, you're going to see some other things in that tree that would be a little bit of a problem. But that would be how I would rank that one. I would make a note about that. It's 20%, but that is such a significant dieback. That's generally. And most of the time when you see dieback, you're going to see it pretty much restricted around the crown. It's a general sort of a characteristic or symptom of the problem. But what if you just get a few? What about our flagging? How do you deal with that? So we'll see this sort of thing. These are a couple of examples of some trees we deal with. So we'll look at the end of the branch and we'll say, you know, like the one on the left, I really don't have a whole lot. It's incipient dieback. It's one branch. Maybe somebody did some work and cut some roots or something, and we got a little bit. It's less than 5%. It's only on that side of the tree, and it's less than 5% of the whole tree. So I really don't have a lot of heartburn about that particular one. I'm on notice. I want to know. I'd be making notes about where it is, because hopefully when someone comes back to that tree for re-inventory, they'll look for that. And if they don't know where it is, and it's gone, I guess that's a good thing, but it'd be nice to be able to look and see if it's still there, to know where to look. The one on the one below, we've got a little more of a dieback in this particular situation on that tree. So it's 50%. Those branches there are almost totally gone, but the tree is okay. It's individual branches. Again, we call that flagging to some degree. It's 10% of the entire crown, 50% of that individual. And as an arborist, as I'm looking at it, I want to know both of those numbers. It happens to be one and the same up there on the one on the left. So I don't have as much, but I really want to know what's going on with that one, because greater than 50% branch diebacks tell me there's something else going on with the tree, but I'm not as concerned about the tree because it's only 10%. I want to go look at that tree is what happens with that. That's the difference between those two. So any questions about those? That's when it gets a little more of a challenge looking at these. So we good? All right. Well, tomorrow we're going to go out and play in the field. That's the best part. That's where the fun begins as we go out. So I'm going to hand it back to Morgan at this point, so she can take you there.
Okay, well, awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing all that information about tree condition. It's definitely very informative for me. I hope so for all of you guys. We
and
do
Morgan,
have
if I could, real quick,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Heather just put up an excellent reference on the chat. Oh, you want to tell them about that? Yeah.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So coconut rhinoceros beetle. This is something that I've seen in American Samoa. Interestingly, it's not killing the palms in Samoa. It's distorting them and causing a real problem. But in Guam, it is destroying all of the palms. In fact, down there, some of my colleagues in Guam are telling me that palms, I don't agree with them. The palms are going to be extinct in Guam. Again, I don't agree with them, but that's how serious they're taking it. It tends to go after coconuts in Samoa, but in Guam, it's going after just about everything. So we have it here. If you see any signs of coconut rhinoceros, you see the things, let us know. There's a number of things we're doing to try to control it. It's tough, but let folks know. But this will be palms, but get hold of the sea tartar. If you see something you're not sure it is, a couple things going to happen. You're going to learn something. Or like me, I discovered a new insect that was here that we weren't happy about. And we need to know that as quickly as we can so we can take action to try to prevent it, because you're not going to control these very well. It's prevention early on that's our best tool. So that's why with coconut rhinoceros beetles. So I'm sorry, Morgan, go ahead.
Nope, that's okay. And also we did a webinar with the coconut rhinoceros beetle response team in the fall, I think October time. So if you guys missed that and wanted to know more, we do have that recorded. I can send you the link. And we are planning to do future webinars with them also, so we can keep up on just knowing how to identify those types of issues on our islands. So, but thanks for putting all that information in there, Heather. And there's also, she put in a link for photos too, so you can get an idea of what you'll be looking for. But for tomorrow, Kevin gave us another awesome opportunity to be able to apply some of the information that we talked about today with a hands-on real experience with trees. Like he had said, and I agree too, that the best way to really learn trees is by touching them. So we're going to be meeting in Kailua District Park at 8:30 tomorrow morning over by the baseball field bleachers, and walking around the park, probably some areas in Kailua, just to get some real examples of the types of trees and walking through the conditions of what we see in our neighborhoods here. So if you have questions about that, let me know.
Apply what we've talked about here. And this is really important. I'm helping to write a program for the California Community College on tree risk assessment for people that don't know anything about it. And we're going to do a lot of it online, and you can learn a lot online. We figure about 75%, but really to master it, you got to go out and touch trees. We are very physical. It's kind of like a lawyer that doesn't practice, a surgeon that doesn't operate. They may be real bright in the book, but they don't know. So I would encourage you to come out with us. Come out and have some fun. We'll nerd out on trees. We can talk anything you want. I can show you some of the other things we got. You can bring me some pieces of trees from your yard or something. I'm happy to help you with those as well. But it should be a good time. Should be very, very informative. So thanks. And I saw Kevin put a note up here. Unfortunately, he's in Vancouver. He can't